Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today on art and science of pricing for startups. I'm Natwar Maheshwari. I'm your host today. I'm a PLG marketing director here at Algolia. I also run the Algolia startup program. So my guess is most of you have gotten emails from me about deals, about all the good stuff that we are doing with the program. Without further ado, I'll let Nick introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name is Nick Vlku. I am the VP of Growth here at Algolia. I've been at Algolia for about 2 years. I'll talk a bit about my background in a minute, but I wanted to set the stage for what we're talking about today. Pricing is a really large topic. When we were originally proposing to speak about pricing, there was like a million ways to go, and this deck's gone through a lot of iterations because it could be about startup pricing, it could be about finding the right inflection point. It could be on how to mitigate churn and retention. It could be on how you help your sales team sell. But what I really wanted to do is focus on something that is a little different than most pricing talks that I've seen, which is how do you grow your business? Not necessarily just through acquisition, but through other avenues as well, particularly around expansion. So what I've called this talk is the top line growth trap, which is basically focusing exclusively on getting new people. And I want to talk about how that is important, but there are also other aspects of pricing that are very, very important for the growth of your business. So that is going to be the general gist of the talk. It's going to be a bit of a presentation. And then at the end, I am going to walk through kind of what I do at every company I've been at in terms of pricing analysis. So Nawar alluded to it. I have a simplified version of a Google sheet or Excel sheet that I have used throughout my career to basically do projections, target assessment for metrics, and then also historical analysis. So I'll walk through that sheet, at least how I use it. And then at the end, when you all receive your summary email about this talk with the recording, or if you're watching this on online later in November 2023, there'll be a link in the description to that sheet as well that you can all copy and readily use. With that being said, let's jump in. So. And please put your messages into Q&A. I don't really see it on my one monitor, but I will, at the end, there'll be an opportunity for us to talk and ask each other questions and answers. So the very first thing is I wanted to just talk about like what we're doing here, what are the guiding principles, what are our core strategies, and then what are some key growth levers. And these levers are really, really focused on how pricing isn't just pricing, it's monetization. And I think there's a subtle difference between monetizing and pricing, which is the element of monetization. So we're going to talk about that and why monetization is important, and why I think if you have a startup of any form, some form of monetization and who you're selling to is extremely important, because we're all here to not only build something our customers love, but the number one way our customers show us that they love what we do is they actually pay us for it. That is, in my view, a true expression of appreciation of the product and the fact that you're deriving value for your customer. We'll talk about who are the right customers depending on the life cycle of your startup. This talk is mostly centered around early startups. They could be any form, what they say, everything's a tech startup now, but essentially early form startups that are selling directly to customers. We have to winnow this down, so we're not going to be speaking much about the sales-led growth motion, how to hand people off to a sales team. Could definitely talk about that in the Q&A a bit, and maybe there's going to be a part 2 of this talk. The interchange between the pay as you go, product-led motion, and the sales-led motion is a topic in and of itself. But since there's so much to talk about in only 45 minutes, give or take, with Q&A, I wanted to hyper-focus on one specific area. And then finally, that workshop I mentioned, we're going to go through like kind of how I do pricing myself personally. So who am I? Why am I talking to you? And there's a photo of me in Northern California celebrating with a pina colada getting pricing right, which is very hard to do. So it was like a very relieved day with our pricing plans. But as I mentioned, right now I am the VP of Product Growth at Algolia. And under my purview is essentially the developer experience, signing up for Algolia, and our consumption-based pricing plans. That is the world I live in. So when you go and sign up, you play with the product, you try it out, you upgrade, you pay us with a credit card, that belongs in my world. Prior to that, I was at Twilio for about 8 years where I ran a slew of jobs. But one of the big ones there was I ran their growth organization as well. Previous to that, there was Live Nation. Trove was my own startup, which would have benefited from knowing more about pricing when I did. And then I also was at Goldman Sachs. So you can see there's a huge mix here of B2C, B2B, very developer technical, SaaS companies, and then also companies where the technology was in the business, but in service of the business. And they all kind of have different shades of strategy. But for the most part, there's truisms across the board with all of these companies in terms of what I've learned, which I didn't really expect when I was first looking and thinking about this with a pause. But really a lot of stuff that I learned at Live Nation, Ticketmaster, applied to Twilio, a lot of what and whatnot, and how to engage with both B2C and B2B customers. So that is a bit of who I am. So let's talk about like top line growth first. What do I mean by top line growth? I mean, top line growth is essentially the beginning. I'll dive in a little deeper on what that definition means, but that definition is essentially the top of the funnel of getting people in, getting more people in, getting more people to sign up, and getting more people to pay you, especially that first invoice. That's top line growth. But I think there's also this other opportunity that we don't talk about a lot, which is expanding your current customers, both with either more usage, more like subscriptions, depending on your model, more seats, or also more opportunities with more products that you create in adjacent to the product that they've signed up for. So what I mean by this is, and I use this TARDIS example because you can kind of like think of that other part of monetization as like, just like a very basic blue phone booth in your office. And you could just treat it as one. Like, oh, it's a phone booth. It's like a thing, but there's all this other stuff around me. But when you go inside the phone booth, there's so much. It's like, if you ever watch Doctor Who, it is like a massive, massive thing inside that phone booth. And so I think there's a massive, massive opportunity around monetization and a very healthy way to monetize, just sitting around. And I think a lot of people are hyper-focused on that very beginning of the funnel. You're starting to see more of a change over time as, investors are becoming a little more diligent about growth at all expense and all cost versus sustainable growth. So I'm going to talk a bit about why this is important for growth. And I'm going to talk a bit about why this is important for pricing and how to think about it as you price. And then we'll jump into some examples as well of where this works best. So think about the TARDIS in your office or your WeWork or your at-home office and think about what could be inside it, because I think a lot of people just walk past it. Who uses a phone booth anyway today? So I want to harken back to something old school. This is a pretty common thing that like has been said in the industry. This is at this point like gospel. It was made by, coined by Dave McClure, who is back at like 500 startups and also at PayPal. And he in 2007 talked about the R method. And the R method is essentially the life cycle of your customer. And it is what it says there. There's acquisition, there's activation, there's retention, and then there's revenue, and then there's referral. So just through the funnel real quick to define what these means. Acquisition is getting your people in. And this goes back to like, how do you get your people in? It could be through organic traffic. It could be through word of mouth. It could be through a referral program, which is at the end, but it also could be through paid advertising. It could be through cold calling. There's a lot of ways to get people to the door. And this talk is not going to really be about that, but there are a lot of strategies and they all have their ROIs around them. Activation is very different for every company, but activation is that sweet spot where a customer has found value in the product and has reached that point where they understand the value. And they have a higher propensity of sticking around. So I don't want to spend too much on this because most people hopefully like notice a bit if you're in the startup space, but essentially Pinterest classically has a certain number of pins was their activation metric because customers changed. For Facebook back in the day you needed a certain number of friends to be activated. So they were hyper-focused on getting people to that threshold. At Algolia, it's getting you to a certain number of searches. That's our activation metric internally. Retention is now keeping people. And the retention model can go in many directions. It could go into like giving them a monthly bill. It can get them into a committed contract. But retention is they stick around. Revenue is what follows retention, people who stick around pay, and then referral, if they truly love your product, brings you more people. So this is truly a happy path virtuous cycle. And in a way to kind of divide into three segments, I would say, if you clump these together. The first two are like getting the customers in some ways. The second two are keeping, or the middle is keeping the customer. And the third is getting more money from said customer. So all three of these are really, really important. And I think when you split R up to the AA, the ARR, and the RR, your opportunities here to kind of turn the knob on all of these. And I think our industry has gone very good at turning that knob at the beginning of the funnel. But I think there's opportunities that are really important in the middle of the funnel, and especially around like growing with your customers helping be a partner with your customer. And I want to talk a bit about how pricing can help, because I feel like pricing, when we discovered this at Algolia and at Twilio previously, pricing can easily turn a relationship with your customer into a partnership with your customer, where you share in the success of that customer as they grow, or it actually can turn into an impediment if you don't get it right. So I wanted to talk a bit about that as well. So there are moments in time, there's inflection moments here. And these inflection moments essentially are really your opportunity to like kind of get people and get them to grow and get them to stick around and get them to become very successful customers. Because if your customers are successful, you end up being successful. So this is where we get into some funny data that I think people, I feel like a lot of people know are, but there's a study that came out by Bessemer, and there was another one by Profitwell. And these are both VCs that tend to hang out mostly in the SaaS, software as a service space, particularly infrastructure SaaS in a lot of cases with Bessemer. So what they have noticed is that for basically, where do you put your money and what is your return on that money in the short to medium term? So one of the things they discovered with their study of the 174 SaaS companies that they either have relationships with or invest in is that on average, for every dollar generated for a customer on acquisition costs is about $1.13, which means you're paying more to initially acquire this customer than what you make from this customer. And the intent is over time, as this customer grows and grows and sticks around, that initial upfront cost of the customer, that acquisition cost, eventually becomes closer to nothing if the customer monetizes, sticks around. But generally speaking, at the very early stages of the company, you're spending more to acquire a customer. That being said, if you already have a customer and that customer is happy and you want to grow that individual customer, for every dollar of new revenue generated from expansion, it typically on average takes about 27 cents to grow that extra dollar. And it makes sense if you think about it, because when a customer is already using your product, there's a few things that happen here. One is marketing or reaching out to that customer, either through the in-app experience, through a dashboard if you're an infrastructure company, through just regular communications with the customer. That cost is significantly lower than, participating in the advertising market or participating in renting out a space for a meetup or things like that. So this does make sense, but I think in a lot of cases, we're so good at hyper-focused on strategies around acquisition that we kind of don't really think about how do we grow our current customers. There's a lot of good reasons this is really helpful. And I'll talk about other reasons for around monetization being really, really important. But generally speaking, both studies have shown that for very little cost upfront relative to acquisition, you can easily monetize people and get more money from them if you invest in them, either through reach out campaigns, introduction of new products, or working with your customers to get them to use the product in a more effective way, which means they can use it for more of their existence. And a lot of very, very, very successful startups really focus on monetization. If you think of a Slack, for example, their monetization of getting a team onto the company, onto Slack, and then getting the company onto Slack, and then getting every new employee of the company onto Slack is a virtuous cycle. So as a company grows, so does Slack in terms of its success with that company. There are companies that have really hyper-focused exclusively on acquisition. And I think in a lot of cases, these companies are facing difficulty in the last few years. WeWork's a good example of someone recently in the news who was an acquisition at all cost company. And in the end, because of that, their people never monetized or retained. So they're an special example because of office space, but there are other companies similar to WeWork that are really growth at all cost. And I think growth at all cost is important, but we also need to think about our current customers and make sure they stick around and don't churn. So with that being said, this is kind of like the paradox. And I want to talk about this a little. And this is kind of this picture in my mind is the picture of pricing. And I think this is the dance people make in their head. And I'll talk a bit about how I do this dance myself at Algolia and at Twilio. But generally speaking, you haven't, I think people are really good at what I would refer to as the incentive to sell, which is how much does it cost to sell something? How much does it cost me as a company to run this thing? And then charge a little more or less, depending on where my company is in terms of my strategy. And then that is what I charge. So it's pretty easy to And we've noticed this when we ever do pricing changes and when we do pricing proposals and we do projections, every company I've worked at, it is so easy to do that part of the projection. It's like, okay, it costs this much money. If we have scale, we can pay a little less and it'll cost this much money. And a lot of the advantages of that side of the scale is economies of scale. If you're in software, if you're in tech, if you're in pharmaceuticals, if you're in a bunch of company sectors, there is definitely a very, very dramatic cost advantage as you get bigger. The first one costs a lot of money. The second one costs a lot less. And then they eventually, through scale and volume, cost less and less and less. But that first widget, that first pill, that first like customer, very expensive. But then the second is cheaper and the third. So that's usually the growth. That is usually how pricing is reflected there. And it's really easy to extrapolate that. The other side is really hard, which is value. And is what is your customer? What is the value of this product to your customer? And that is the incentive to buy. So you have the incentive to sell, which is like, we need to recoup our costs and we need to make a business that is sustainable. But we also now have to price it in a place where the customer actually derives value. This is a very, very hard conversation. And one that is, I was originally going to talk about this exclusively, but it is so bespoke to your use case, to what you're creating, and to the customer you're selling to, that it's really hard to provide broad strategies around this. What I would say from my previous experience is you're trying to look at everything from the competitive landscape to the cost savings or the productivity gains or the joy gains, if you're a B2C company, that your product can bring. And it is a constant iteration. And we'll talk about that a bit, because you will not get this right on the first try. But it is a constant iteration, and it is a constant test, and it is a constant conversation with your customers. Value-based pricing is the ultimate gold star for SaaS, but it requires quite a bit of work. And we at both Algolia and at Twilio previously, and at Live Nation as well, to some degree, we would constantly engage with our customers either through broad data analysis, like when do people churn, how do they churn, to individual customers. We would reach out to customers and go, hey, how is the product going? We would reach out to them when they were leaving. We'd reach out to them when they did certain events, and we'd like actually engage with them. And we have an entire group of customers that we talk to all the time about this stuff, because pricing should not be designed in a black box. Customers appreciate being a part of the conversation about pricing, because they know what the value is to them. And you can underprice a product, and that can hurt you just as much as overpricing a product, because it can diminish the perceived value of the product if you underprice it. So it's a really tough one. And there's strategies there, there's scripts, there's ways to talk to your customers. But if you're not really talking or watching your customer behavior, it is a very, very, very difficult thing to do. But it is critical. A little bit of a story. When I first joined Algolia about 2.5 years ago, I personally think our product's great, and but there might be bias here, but I do think it's great. As I had to start that was search-based previous to Algolia, but we struggled with pricing. We actually, I think we had impediments where people were like, I love Algolia, but I don't think it's as accessible to me because of how much you charge for certain things. So we completely changed our pricing plan based on that, and we did a lot of analysis to make sure it made sense. But we kind of turned the conversation around. So pricing ended up becoming a good story for the company and for customers, not a thing that they have to work through, because we priced it, we hit that sweet spot pricing. And that was a very long exercise with our customers, and a very long exercise, which I'll show you on our side of like, what do the numbers have to look like for this to make sense for us? So it is really difficult, but I think it's the gold star. And every company in the world, if it exists, it should be providing some value to someone who's willing to pay for it. So it's just figuring out exactly how people price that, what people think of that value. So that being said, I want to talk about like the people you go after, because this conversation is easier with certain people. And I know everyone's seen this one. This one's a very classic graph, which is the adoption cycle. We have people on the left side who are like, the first, we either are all those people in the room right now, or we know people who are those people who buy the very first like Oculus Rift on Kickstarter. And then we have people who will like not buy anything like that till like 2050, which is on the other side. And so you cannot go after all these people on day one, even on day two. This is a lot. They're very different people. They're very different personas. Everything about them is totally different. in terms of how you communicate value to them, in terms of their ability or their desire to like try something new first. It's very tough. So what I would propose is you really want to work on the early market. The early market are essentially the early adopters, also the innovators. These two, in a lot of ways, are very, very similar. In fact, we have discovered that the visionaries tend to be the enthusiasts who are now actually willing to put real money behind it. That's generally the gist. Like the enthusiasts are like, I am screwing around under my desk with like this product, like with the computer. I am like playing with this thing on the weekend. I think this is really valuable. Or I'm going to introduce this for myself or me and 2 team members to like see if it makes us more efficient. The visionaries are like, okay, I run a group of 50 people or whatnot, and like I want to be on the edge, the bleeding edge as a company. And those are those people. There's a chasm here. And this is the famous chasm. How do you get people beyond the visionaries to the pragmatists and to mainstream? I would say that the important thing here is those first 2 are really critical to get you there. You can't really get there, especially with something new, right away. And I'll talk about why. But the best case scenario or the happy path is in a lot of cases, if you do a really great job as a partner with the companies you work with, you do a great job with pricing, you do a great job with feature set, those people grow with you. So what that means is a good example at Twilio, one of our first customers was Uber back in the day. And we're talking about Travis in San Francisco with 6 buddies with a black card that they paid a monthly fee to just try, and they wanted a centralized phone number to like call the black car. That was the beginning of Uber, and Uber turned out to be so big a customer in the end as they grew with us that they turned out to be happened right after IPO. They turned out to be like a risk because they were such a huge short of our revenue. First class problem, but it shows that you can really drive and ride businesses as well. Your success is your success. You want to be able to couple the two. And so that was a really powerful thing that I learned at Twilio, because a lot of our biggest customers turned out to, be small companies that got big. In a way, you're almost like your company can also be almost like a VC in some ways, where you're kind of like making bets in terms of where you're investing, in terms of the customers you're getting, knowing that a few will succeed. And over time, you grow your organization, you grow your reputation, and you get yourself larger and larger customers. But you really want to go after the cutting edge first, which is essentially this persona. And this is essentially the early adopter. Now, the early adopter is great for a lot of reasons. The early adopter is kind of on the, they are typically a person who works for a small to medium-sized company who knows that their value add versus large companies and really large companies is that they can be more nimble, they can be more reactive, they can be more curated and more engaged with their customers. They know they're building a problem to attack a market that either is entrenched with a large player and isn't as efficient. In a lot of cases, they've discovered a problem that they've seen themselves, or they just want to do something that they think will make people around them, their customers, either B2B or B2C, more happier, which can be more productive, and be enjoying downtime more. It really depends on your product. But these are those people that you go after at first, because they're the people that are more likely to take that chance, take that risk. They're also going to be a good partner for pricing, because you're never going to really have a really good value pricing conversation, or it's very difficult with a very large company that isn't just about closing a deal. Here, these people are the people who tend to be both buyers and users at the same time. So, and they tend to be excited. Like they are there because they're excited what you're working on. These are your sweet bread and butter, and these are the people you go after first. Going back to our analogies earlier, we had a few other big companies that started really like Instacart, and they were very excited because we made their lives easier. They tend to be CEOs of small companies, CPOs, product managers. They could also be in big companies, somewhere in the big company. So you could be a product manager at a very large company that gives its PMs a bit of autonomy, so they can sign up and try the product. Their CTOs, digital leads, those are them. And their goal is they want to make their product better. So these metrics here are business metrics that they're trying to cater towards. These are just some of them. But in general, what you want to do, you want your product when you're building it to have an intent of like, it will help someone do something and they're willing to pay this much for it. because of the time, the value, the enjoyment they derive from the product. And these are the people that you can most easily stress test, pressure test, like, test with your fingers and things like that. So these are your first. And eventually you get to bigger and bigger, but they're the ones that will iterate your pricing. Algolia has gone through a slew of pricing changes in its life. And a lot of those pricing changes were a product of talking to customers and learning from them. They also are the ones that will help you. They're also the ones that will help you expand your current customers. They're the ones that will say, hey, I am doing this thing over and over again in addition to your product. Maybe it's a feature you should add. Maybe it's another piece of functionality. And now we go back to, it is easier to build new functionality, and it is easier to build new features to solve a pain point that you see in aggregate across your customers and grow your customers, not only because you're growing their individual usage, but then they stick around longer. You're receptive, you're responsive, you solve their problems, you solve adjacent problems. You now have them more invested in your company. And then they become huge net promoters of your company. And then this all goes back to like, hey, instead of like just going and hunting, your product gets better by investing on people who are already using it, comfortable with it, and growing it. This an example, both at Algolia and at Twilio, we released products adjacent to our current product. At Twilio, messaging was not our first product, voice was, and everyone talked about, oh, I wish I could text too. That's where it came up. Algolia has a very tunable search index, but people wanted to be able to set up very specific, hey, if someone searches for this thing, I want these 3 things to show up first. So we built that functionality, and that again was user sourced. These are those people that will help you with this, which then will also help you with how to price these new features. Like, is this a good price? This is a bad price. And that could be everything from a conversation to an experiment, an A/B test that you can then see how it does. So there's a lot of opportunity here with these types of customers. And this is how you ultimately cross the chasm. Like, you cross the chasm, there's a million strategies, but the real big one is you make your current customers happy, you grow your current customers. Your customers as humans either leave to other companies, so they come along with your product as a tool chest. They tell their friends because they're, hanging out with their friends, and your product, they mention it because it's a cool B2C product, or you're wearing something from that. These are your cut people. These are your net promoters. These are, as Malcolm Gladwell will call, your super nodes in a lot of cases. So they're precious humans, and they're precious people to really take care of. So now to the guiding principles. Basically a summary of what we had, and I'm going to jump into the workshop for about 5-10 minutes, walk through it a little, and then we'll open this up for some questions. So the very, very first workshop is thoughtful. The very first guiding principle, sorry about that, was is you have to be thoughtful about who you're going after. And like, you can't go after everyone on day one. So you should go after, especially if you're early as a startup, you should go after those who have the highest appetite for both risk and innovation. Because when you're the new kid on the block, you're going to want people who want to give the new kid on the block a shot, because you are better than the current people for various reasons. So those are the people you go after. Don't go after the big people at first. They're also the ones that will be your partner in the end, over time. Monetization is more than pricing. I cannot state this enough. In terms of monetization is more than pricing, and monetization is more than just getting people into the front door. Monetization is everything from getting people into the front door, keeping people so they don't leave. Churn can be very, very pervasive. And churn is more than just money leaving. In a lot of cases, churn is goodwill leaving. Churn is negative sentiment leaving. People leave, and they either leave because they didn't find value in the product's functionality, or they didn't find value that matched the price. Those are people leave because they showed up and they're like, oh, it doesn't do what I need it to do, which is really valuable data. Or, you know what, I love this thing, but not enough to pay like $10 a head. So really important. Think about that too. I think a lot of people don't really think about churn up front when they're working, but you really should look at it on day one. It's a valuable trove of information, and it is also a valuable feedback loop to make things better. And you got a good pricing plan, and you've solved the problem when your churn numbers actually dramatically improve. There's like a inflection point with a pricing plan. So it's an important thing to watch. And the other thing is, pricing is not set it and forget it. And it's not set it and forget it, period, not just early. When you get bigger, it isn't set it and forget it, because if you're talking to really large companies that you're selling towards, and when I worked at Goldman Sachs, I was on the other side buying products as well. Every one of those things is a deal. So even then, in a very directed way, when you're talking to a big company, you're not setting it and forgetting it. You're iterating, you're negotiating a deal. On the early side, when you're not really working with those kinds of companies, it is constant testing, and it is constant measuring of your metrics. Has your sign up number gone up? Has your churn number gone down? Has your expansion number gone up? I, for one, would always want more activity for the same amount of money that I collect, because it means that the value the customer is we're providing to the customer is being evidently translated, because they are using us more. And we have known in our past that expansion revenue, especially at Algolia, once you hit a certain threshold of searches, and especially when you hit a certain threshold of like certain behavioral characteristics, we know that you're more likely to stick around. And ironically or purposely, people who use our product in certain ways that our pricing plan kind of nudges us towards. For example, we know the value in Algolia is not saving your data in Algolia. It's searching and exposing your data and making it searchable, basically indexing the world. So our pricing plan, where we whittle down our records to as low as we can, and we've given a very generous free tier, 1 million free records. And our old plan was 10,000 free records. And because we made a conscious decision that like, we just want to kind of break even with our costs for the most part on records. That's what we care about. But we want people to search like crazy. And so what we discovered is, even when people start searching, even on the older plans, they turned out to be much better customers. They retained better, they churned less, actually ended up paying us more, ironically. Even though, and so our new plans, when the prices are lower, we're actually in a, like, there's better, healthier behavioral characteristics, because we really had a eye on the prize. Like, okay, our job at Algolia is to be the best search engine on the planet, not to be Dropbox. So let's get rid of that impediment around storing the data and get people to searching. And it turned out to be, these new pricing plans launched in March of this year. And every single chart that we have about activity, you can actually spot the pricing plan change. Because going back to that pina colada, celebrating, we got it right. And we're not done. Well, now pricing's like never done. But like it was positive green shoots. So the last 5 minutes, I am going to run through how to do this. So this is what I call startup pricing in a box. The startup pricing in a box is, how do you, what are some strategies you can do here? This is more of the applied part. So the first thing is, you really need to start early. And this could be, you basically need to get, there's stakeholder alignment here. And stakeholder alignment could be like you and your 2 co-founders. It could be the contractors you're working with. It could be like your entire team. But essentially, when we say stakeholder alignment, it's everything around like the financial part of it, which again could be you as CEO, the marketing side of it, the social side of it, and the engineering side of it. Because a lot of these pricing plans might also, depending on the change, require engineering work. If you're going to price on a different metric, that will require work. So start early. Seriously, like, this is not something you can whip out in a week. You really want to make sure you start early. You want to make sure you do some analysis, which I'll talk about in a second. You want to make sure that the engineering work is understood to make these pricing changes. And then you also want to make sure you market these pricing changes. And no one will know if you don't announce the pricing changes out there. So start early, super important. The second thing is, do your research. Like, if most likely you are in a space that if it doesn't have a direct competitor, it at least has adjacent competitors that are trying to provide the same value you're trying to provide, or trying to close a hole in value. You're an expense reporting company, there's competitors. Why are you better? Emergency paging company, same thing. Understand the competitive landscape. Don't copy it. We know, I've seen companies literally copy other companies. They change pricing, they don't do that. But understand the motivations behind our pricing and use that as a factor for yours. Again, focus on value. Basically, the value is how you're solving the problem and how you're doing it better. There's some examples here. You deliver it on time. You have really good SLAs. You have really good customer service. You have a really sexy UI. You're mobile first in this new world, and the old tool is built in 1997 and is like Internet Explorer first. Focus on your value. Again, go back into surgically segment. This is where it gets more interesting. At the very beginning, you probably want to find the best price point for value for early adopters, as your company grows, we Algolia, this is one of our dances, different people find different value in the product. And so how do you find ways to segment your product? This is a little more of an advanced form, where if you have certain companies that are like, oh, we really find, like, for example, search really valuable because we're e-commerce, or, oh, we love search because they keep people on our site because we're a news site, but search doesn't directly translate to giving us a credit card in the same way. It attracts maybe more to like subscriptions. They find different value in the product. So then figuring out how you can differentiate the two customers through either feature set or whatnot, go after one, like, hey, you're an e-commerce company, here's some cool e-commerce features. That's a good way to differentiate, which then you can differentiate on pricing. Patch your leaks. Really important too, as you get bigger and bigger. What we've discovered in the past is, as you get in, going back to that top line growth problem, if you give it away for free, if you give it away at crazy, crazy discounts, you are going to have a hard time later. Like the rooster is going to come home. There are definitely companies out there, delivery companies, that offer free delivery or like discounts, like 50% off your first 5 orders. And there's all these stories of people doing that and never coming back after 5 orders. Be careful with this. I'm not saying don't discount. Watch your discounts closely. And then analyze obsessively. All of this is a feedback loop. Every single time you do a change, every single time you patch your leaks, make sure you're really, 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 really careful with how you're doing. So this is just the motion, and I want to talk about the doing the research part and the analyze part, and like how we do it here. So I'm going to first show a screenshot of this spreadsheet that I use, which is it's a simplified form of the spreadsheet that I've used in a few places previously, and that's one caveat. It's simplified. And then the second caveat is this sheet and this entire talk really focuses on the product-led growth motion, which is people go to your website, they sign up, they use the thing, they give you a credit card, then they use it for more things. They use it for production, or they use it in the real world. Like, you go to Slack, you get 5 free team members with 5 days of history and all these things, and then you upgrade and then you get more. This simplified version does not include the sales life cycle part, where how many of your people who are paying by credit card can now go to the sales organization, and the sales organization can sign them on a commitment with a discount or with like more enterprise services and things like that. There is that aspect too, but that aspect is a whole other talk, and it might be a good part too. But the sheet, as I'm showing, will only really be focusing on the PLG product motion, not the SLG motion, which is a whole other sheet. So that being said, this is the first half of the worksheet. So what we got here is top of funnel. So tofu, as people often say. So the tofu funnel is essentially, and the way to read this real quickly, Q2 is the very first quarter ever in the history of the business, and Q3 is the second quarter. So you can see the gray bars are essentially percentage changes that are actuals. And then I have 2 other quarters, Q4 and Q1, which are not actuals, they're targets. And whereas the numbers in gray are pre-computed based on the white numbers, so this 12% is, the percentage change from here to here. This is not an editable number. These numbers are editable. So in this case, like, we're going to expect a 3% change here. That's what this new number is. And the numbers down below adjust appropriately. So right at the very top, we have traffic and organic traffic. I put these out separately in every place I've ever worked, because paid traffic tends to convert not as well as organic traffic. People who are obviously, but at the very beginning of the business, you're probably going to get more paid traffic. Organic traffic, though, can include things like your product hunt lists, links, news, hacker news, and all of those things will be in organic, but we find that those tend to do better than paid in general. And then you look at like the conversion to sign up, and 1.2% number, generally speaking, you want to aim for somewhere in the 2% range on this one, generally speaking, but then you can see that number then turns into signups. Activation is what we mentioned before. Like it is that moment in time. And this is a definition that there'll be a lot of ideation on wherever you work because it will always kind of get better. Our activation went from like a number of days using the product to number of searches done with the product in the past 2 years during my time here. What's nice is both of those numbers can be backfilled through historical data, so we can at least keep trending. But generally speaking, your activation number is they have hit a certain threshold in the product. They have made 7 friends on Facebook, for example. How many people have done that? Your CVR there, real quickly, for a SaaS company, 23% is considered best in class, 23 to 25, best in class. And that's blended. So if you're typically your paid tends to be into teens and your organic tend to be into 20s or 30s or high 20s. And then there's new paying customers. These are the people like your credit card, boom, we're now paying for the product. And whatever that can be by by seats. It could be by consumption. Most of the places I've worked consumption based and things like that. So that's the first half. And then you can see the forecasts are next. And this forecast is figuring a 3% traffic increase, 2%, a 2% CVR increase, and things like that. So this is how this one works. Now we go on the other direction, which is the revenue side of the product. Now, the revenue side is we both have an entry and an exit number. So basically, it's how you started the in this case, this is how you started the quarter and then how you ended the quarter. Some definitions here: monthly recurring revenue. This is flavored as a consumption-based plan. That's basically the amount of money your customer paid, at least in this world, in my world, the last month of the quarter. So basically, take all the, like, let's say, it's March, end of the quarter. It's the invoices in March for all the customers. Entry is then the beginning because it tails in to the beginning of the next quarter, and then so forth and so on. The first one is new customers. This is how much money you're making from new customers. These are customers that have literally never been here before, and they have signed up. Expansion, and they have never paid before. These can actually, in this world, come from you signed up last quarter, especially on quarter boundaries, but they haven't paid us till the next quarter. And those people would still be considered new for the new quarter, at least in all the financial work I've ever done. Expansion is people who have currently paid us. What are they now paying us? And then you add those two up, and that is your total new revenue. And you can see there's a lot of divided by zeros at the beginning because the math doesn't work because there's empty fields. Contraction is the opposite side. These are customers who have contracted. So that means they're spending a little less this month than last month. And then what is their rate? So you can see this business here has very, 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 very low contraction. Most likely because this model here is a seats-based model. So contraction tends to be more stable than a consumption-based model. Churn is people who just leave. They leave. They're gone. And that's the revenue they took with them when they left. So that is revenue that has disappeared. These are all negative numbers, by the way. And then committed, since we're not doing SLG here, or sales-led motion, is the number of people who've committed. Because what ends up happening is, in most models, that customer now leaves your books. So this is also a negative number, but it's like a good negative number. Because that means the sales organization, you handed off 10K to the sales organization, you turned it into like a 120K contract for the year. That's a good number. That's a good negative number. And so those are your overall negatives. And then at the end is the delta. So basically you take total new revenue, you take the total loss revenue, A minus B equals C, which is PAYGO MRR. And then that is your new revenue that has been added over your previous revenue. So 30,450 plus 30,000, 31,000 essentially leads to that. And then you can see your delta, your growth of your change growth. So it's like your derivative of your derivative is 100%. Generally speaking, some benchmark numbers for the industry, especially if you're looking at software as a service. You typically in your first year, if you're primary tool for something, which means you are like the tool for expense reporting for the company, you would be, or you're a search engine for the company, your first year, typically year over year, is about 140% for a high growth startup. And then it peters out to like 90, 80 your second year. on average, not best in class, worst class, but down the middle. If you're a secondary tool, which means you're not like you're a tool that augments another tool, or you're a tool that augments like let's say you have a data analysis tool, but it's not your data tool. It's just a data analysis tool that you're using on top of your data. Those tend to accelerate a little slower. And so your first year for those best, average class, sorry, not best in class, about 70%. So keep those in mind as your sanity checking your numbers. And there's a lot of great data. I would really recommend reading a lot of Bessemer's work around this. I think they do really great work around this kind of motion. So with that being said, we got like a little under 10 minutes left, give or take. Let me switch to the slide real quick. I'll spend 2 minutes on this real quickly just to show it. And once we're done with that, I'll open up the questions. So here you go. So if you see here, we got our Q3, Q4. And so what we can do here, for example, if we want to project that we're going to do way better than 3%, we do 10, you can see a bunch of numbers start changing underneath. And so what's great about this is you can kind of, as you go down the funnel, your goal with the funnel is always to patch the leaks, patch the leaks, patch the leaks. And so what we do is we tend to focus on a very specific part of the funnel for a bit of time, just to make sure it's as good as it gets. Then we go to the next one or previous one, and we basically try to find the biggest pain points. So we can be like, in the month of May, we're going to really focus on activation. So we're going to really try to get that number up. And in the month of June, we're going to really focus on retention. So we're going to get that number up or turn that corollary, the inverse of it, down. So what's great about this is you can go through and you can be like, okay, so we are actually going to focus this month on getting that churn number super, super down from 4% to like 1%. You can see the impact. Now, these numbers are relatively small here, but they compound. So it doesn't just affect this number, it affects everything beyond going forward forever in the sheet. And it's very easy to add a new column as you keep rolling. And it's very easy to turn a forecast column into a target column. I'm sorry, a target column into an actuals column. Really easy to do that as well with a sheet. So what we usually do at Algolia, and then we have a ton of other stuff for the sales motion underneath, is we use this thing to kind of track how we're doing. We see how we're trend lining. We have a bunch of analysis with bar graphs that we report to the executive leadership team. But this, at least from a very baseline level, really is how we instrument our funnel. And it's very easy to add more rows to this thing and then just slightly change some equations around these rows. It's not rocket science, but we've discovered if we make it too complicated, it becomes really hard to, it becomes so complicated that the tool is obfuscating what we're trying to analyze and see. So it's I think we've over time hit the sweet spot of complexity, but not obfuscation. So this sheet will be shared with the presentation by when it's sent out later this week, and will be included in, if you're watching this on one of the online thingies, it'll be down there in the description. So I welcome all of you to just use it, copy it, edit it, and definitely if you have any questions post this conversation, you could always reach me at nick.vlku@algolia.com. And that's how I'll be glad to respond to anyone who has any questions about this, or if anyone wants to talk, because there's a lot of bespoke parts of this conversation. So with that being said, I want to flip to the Q&A slide and then turn off my shirt. All right. Thank you all.
Hey, that was fun, Nick. Yeah, this I think to everyone, we'll definitely share everything, but there are a few questions here in Q&A which I want to kind of raise here real quick. So Nicholas is asking, if CAC is highest for the first customers, should a business initially price high to finance future acquisitions, or low, close to free, and then increase prices gradually so that it's easier to get the first customers? That's a great question.
So that's a really great question. And the answer is it depends. But I like all these, but I think what's really subtle here in terms of the CAC is you really want to line up your actual costs to your price to something around where you think the business will be viable. Like, that's why I say it depends. Like, you can't go if you go really, really low, like 3 months of free office space, you're really setting yourself up for a point where at a certain point in time when you want to either change your pricing to make it closer to your cost of goods sold, and that's really in my mind, the waterline or the red line. If you're so below it, like we have a local delivery company here that like basically does free delivery 15 minutes and it's zero. That's definitely costing them more than zero. And if they don't have a smooth ramp up from zero to something, people just stop using it. We've seen this with, rideshare companies. We've seen this with office companies. We've seen this with a ton of companies. So don't go too low, I would say. But also, what I would also focus on is as you project out your growth curve for the company, and you can't do this right away because you're going to need to do a few months of seeing how your company's uptake is going, you can start factoring in economies of scale. So buying reserved instances on AWS or buying things like that. So it's not necessarily what you want to be mindful is you have two moving targets here. One is your costs will change as you get bigger and bigger because you'll have more negotiating power, you'll have more volume, and putting 20 customers on an instance is cheaper than putting one customer on an instance. But at the same time, if you go so low, you're not only devaluing the product because now you're like saying, oh, my product's not worth more than $0 or $1, but then you're also creating a moment in time, which we struggled with as both a lot of places I've worked at where we price so low that there was no real way to retain these people after we want to change their price to something that's sustainable for the business. So being mindful is super important about that line. And that's why I go back to A/B testing and constant monitoring. And of course, it's always easier to lower prices than raise prices. Just as another thing. It's very hard to raise a price on a customer. It's very easy to lower a price. But you also don't want that price to be like you don't want to charge double the competition or something on day one because you're never going to get you won't get your people in the door. So what I would recommend is more of a freemium model in some of these cases where you create a free version of your product that gets you up to the activation point or a little beyond the activation point. And then you can upsell. So now they've gotten the taste of the product and then you can now upsell the product to that customer. And when you're very early, that can be a very hands-on thing. That could be you reach out to the customers and go, hey, we see you've been loving this product. You've hit 10,000, entries in the table. You want to talk about how we can make this better for you and how we can unlock more functionality. I would definitely use that approach. And that's the approach we do here. We have a very, very, very generous free tier, but the whole intent of our free tier at Algolia is to get you to find value in the product, not to devalue the product. And then once you find that value, you're like, okay, this is really wonderful. I want to make this my stores or my newspaper search box. Now I will give you a credit card. I hope that helps.
No, definitely. I think in past you've also shared something that has helped a lot, Nick. There was about attracting the right kind of users. I think pricing and monetization, like that thought process. If you're too cheap or closer to free, you attract certain kind of customers. And I think you've talked about this in the past as well, which has been super helpful here. William is asking, okay, it's a longer question, right? They've been working on a new SaaS product, all right, in a highly technical area. That's a little deliberate, little vague. That's fine. We can now perform this process for somewhere between 5 to 10% of what it would usually cost using traditional methods. How would you price something like that? So it used to be more expensive. Now they have gotten the cost down drastically. How should they think about the pricing?
So I think there's two things to keep in mind here. One is it really depends on the addressable market of this space. If we're talking about cruise ships, there's 20 cruise ship providers in the world. It becomes harder to do that price differential because one, these are very large companies and it's hard to break into these companies. If this is a product that is very much a self-service product, it is or a product that people can just use regardless of the size of the company. One way to pitch this thing is to look at the competitive space, talk about the features of the competitive space, and then talk about the pricing. What I would caveat you on is a 5 to 10% decrease in price is usually not motivation enough to move to a new product for a company or for a user. What is really important is the feature set and the functionality provided in addition to it. So taking a product and kind of just automating it, taking a process, and the gain is it's 5% less expensive to do with my product, isn't the pitch that I would use. If it is taking something that is tedious and mindless and consumes lots of humans and deliver 90% less, never mind. Okay, sorry, that's a whole different ballpark. So with 90% less, what I would say is the value there is one is figure out what that actually turns into financially. Like, what is that general cost the company is spending on that today? This is either through competitive intel. If this is a space that you're already familiar with, because a lot of these are itches that people see themselves, knowing what your bill was at the last company you're at that you had this idea in, that is a good like data point to use. I would definitely not price it at 90% lower, because it also sends a certain signal like, oh, we're 10%, it's good. But I would definitely price it to a price advantage. But I would also try to find more than just the price. You really want the price to not be the impediment getting into the door. But in a lot of cases, you also want to talk about why is it 90% better? Is it 90% better because it's less humans? Is it because it's got a much better UI UX? Is it better because like it can be done on the go as opposed to sitting in front of a computer? You don't have to open up a VM with IE6. I think those are all extremely valuable pitches in addition to the price. But in the end, even a 90% decline in price, which is great, you could price it lower than the competition by quite a bit. And I don't necessarily know if your costs scale in the same way as the cost to the business. Like if running it is 90% cheaper for you versus these big companies, hard to know, because these big companies tend to have a lot of economies of scale to negotiate crazy deals with their vendors and whatnot. But offering it for a cheaper price gets you in, gets people to not run away. And then the next step is, okay, this is why it's not only cheaper, but it's way, way, way better. And I think that don't lose sight of that piece as well, because there's more to the product than just being a cheaper bill. It's an important piece, and it's a piece that you don't have to really worry about, like as a, oh no, it's too expensive. But there, you need to also offer something else, I'd say.
We are almost at time, Nick. So I'm going to just take one more that Nicholas has.
Yeah.
I think Nicholas is asking about, as a follow-up with Algolia, I presume there's a ton of metrics surrounding activation points during free trial. Yes, of course. With free trials, what have you found is the balance between providing value that creates those activation points and providing too much value that can never
This
convert?
is such a great question, because this has been part of my life for 2-3 years now. Like, what a great question. So yes, this is very tough to do. Like, oh, people are just going to be free forever. We are okay with hobbyists and people being free, to be clear. Like, if someone wants to like mess around and put their like Plex, library or like their bookshelf on Algolia and play with it, go to town, man. That is amazing. But what we really focus on, people deriving value, business value from the product. And so the way you cross that threshold is you want to be able to provide enough value for a customer. First of all, you want to decide who you want to charge. If you don't want to charge, like we're okay not charging a mom and pop Shopify store that generates like $150 a month in revenue. Go to town, use us for free. But we want to make sure that when people, they can hang on around the free tier, but we want to create a threshold for the free tier. And we want that threshold to be indicative to like, this is now being used for real by like a reasonably sized customer. So in our world, we discovered that like records are not that. Oh, they're so not that. Like people have shown up to our business and dumped enough records in to figure out if the product works. And because we only had a 10,000 limit previously, they would literally have to give us a credit card to even try the product, because most people have more than 10,000 things. So what we did now is we increased the record limit to a massive number, 1 million. But we didn't really move the search number, which is 10,000 a month. And so what we have landed on is at 10,000 a month, we know for a fact that if you are getting more than 10,000 a month, you're probably doing something different. And because you're doing something different and you're doing something real, you're going to have to upgrade in most cases. And because of that, that is a line that we have tracked. We want to charge people for the value they perceive with our product, which is using search, not storing data. And figuring out what that is for your business is super critical. What is exactly the value? And then what is that threshold? Slack's threshold was number of people in Slack, and then how much history you get. You only get like 30 days. And so those are both good numbers, because I have one Slack with a bunch of friends, but we actually ended up paying for it because we wanted the history. And then another, I have like 6 of them, which is all free. And I think that that's a healthy mix. So I'd be really, really mindful of that. At my last place, we added a look, this is a free trial thing to every text and every phone call at the beginning, which is a great way to try the product. But if you wanted to remove that, you now have to start paying. So I would find that point, that I don't want to say that very slight friction or pressure point where like cross it to like now really use it for real and not just like see if it meets your needs, that's the point where you cross that threshold.
That's
Cool.
awesome. That's awesome. Hey, thanks a lot, Nick. We are a little over time, which is okay. I think people are still hanging out here. So, but hey, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming here.
Thanks, everyone.
Nick, and you'll all get the recordings and a link to that the Google Sheet that Nick was sharing. I'll
Cool.
talk to you all later.
Bye, everyone. Thanks. Bye.